Grace found it in her mailbox one chilly October evening, wedged between junk mail and a gas bill. The front displayed an image of an old Victorian mansion, its shutters askew and paint peeling, framed by a dark forest. On the back, in neat handwriting, were 3 words, "Come find me." There was no return address, just her name written in elegant cursive that she didn't recognize. Grace frowned, turning the card over in her hands. She had no friends who'd send something so cryptic, no family with a penchant for strange jokes. Yet, an odd curiosity tugged at her. Against her better judgment, she searched the address scrawled below the message. It led to a small town called Black Hollow, 2 hours from where she lived. A place she'd never been or even heard of. By the next morning, the postcard was sitting on her kitchen table, and Grace couldn't shake the feeling it was watching her. The drive to Black Hollow was uneventful. Endless rows of trees blurred past her window, their bare branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the overcast sky. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. Part of her was embarrassed by the absurdity of it all. A postcard couldn't compel her to leave her cozy apartment and drive to a remote town. And yet, here she was. The town itself was eerily quiet, the streets lined with faded storefronts and empty benches. It felt abandoned, though she occasionally spotted a curtain twitch or a figure hurrying past. No one met her gaze. The house from the postcard was even more unsettling in person. It loomed at the end of a gravel road, its windows dark and lifeless, its door slightly ajar as if inviting her inside. Grace hesitated at the threshold, but then she heard it, a faint whisper, just beyond the door. Grace. The inside of the house was worse than she'd imagined. The air was heavy and smelled of mildew, and the floorboards creaked beneath her weight. Dust clung to every surface, and cobwebs stretched across the corners. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, clearer this time. Upstairs, her legs felt leaden as she ascended the staircase, each step groaning in protest. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of voices overlapping, all murmuring her name. They led her to a room at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. Inside was a single chair facing a cracked mirror. In the chair sat a doll, life-sized and eerily human, with glassy eyes that seemed to follow her every move. Its hair was dark and matted, its lips painted into a permanent smirk. Grace's heart pounded. "This is insane," she muttered, backing out of the room. But as she turned, the door slammed shut, and the whispers stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then the mirror cracked further, splitting in a spiderweb pattern. The doll's head turned, ever so slightly, and its mouth opened. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its voice like dry leaves rustling. Grace screamed, fumbling for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the doll began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. The walls shuddered, and the air grew colder. Grace turned to see the doll standing now, its movements jerky, like a marionette on invisible strings. The smirk on its face had stretched wider, impossibly so, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Stay," it hissed, lunging toward her. Grace didn't remember how she got out of the house. One moment she was cornered, the doll's laughter ringing in her ears, and the next she was running down the gravel road, her lungs burning and her heart racing. When she finally reached her car, she didn't look back. She sped out of Black Hollow, the mansion shrinking in her rearview mirror. But even as the house disappeared, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. When she got home, she locked every door and window, drew the curtains, and collapsed onto her bed. She told herself it was over, that it had been some cruel prank or a vivid nightmare. But then she saw it. The doll was sitting on her dresser, its glassy eyes gleaming in the dim light. The smirk was wider than before, and in its lap was a new postcard. "Come find me." Grace's scream echoed through her apartment, but no one came. She lived alone, and her neighbors were distant enough to ignore even the most blood-curdling cries. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she stared at the doll, its glossy eyes locked onto hers, its smirk an unspoken taunt. The postcard on its lap was identical to the first. Faded, yellowed edges, neat cursive handwriting. But this time the message was different. "We're waiting for you." Grace's hands trembled as she grabbed the postcard. The address on the back was unfamiliar, leading to another place she'd never been. Her instinct was to throw the card into the trash, to smash the doll and burn everything to ashes. But when she looked back at the dresser, the doll was gone. Her breath caught in her throat. She spun around, scanning the room. Empty. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and twist, as though something was hiding just out of sight. She stumbled backward, bumping into the edge of her bed. A faint whisper broke the silence. "Grace? Come." Her chest tightened. It was the same voice from the house, soft but insistent, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The postcard in her hand felt heavier, the edges cutting into her skin. Against all logic, Grace felt the pull again. She had to go. The next address was a cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. Grace drove through the night, the highway giving way to gravel roads, then dirt paths. Her headlights barely pierced the dense forest, the trees looming like silent sentinels. When she finally reached the cabin, it was just as decrepit as the mansion. Its wooden exterior warped and rotting, its windows boarded up. But unlike the house in Black Hollow, there were no signs of life. Grace stepped out of her car, clutching a flashlight. The night was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every small noise seem deafening. She hesitated at the cabin's entrance, the air around it heavy and foreboding. The door creaked open before she touched it. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and decay. The walls were lined with shelves, each one crammed with jars filled with strange, unidentifiable substances. Some glowed faintly, casting an eerie light that made the shadows dance. In the center of the room was a wooden table, much like the one in the mansion's cellar. On it lay a single object, an old phonograph. Its horn was tarnished, and the crank looked rusted, but it seemed oddly pristine compared to its surroundings. As Grace stepped closer, the phonograph whirred to life. She hadn't touched it, but the needle dropped onto the record with a soft scratch. A distorted voice crackled through the horn. "Do you hear us now, Grace?" Her blood ran cold. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The phonograph continued as if it hadn't heard her. "Come closer. You're almost there." The voice stopped abruptly, replaced by a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Grace looked around, her flashlight flickering. That's when she saw it. A figure standing in the corner, shrouded in shadow. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice rising. The figure didn't move, but the shadows around it seemed to writhe and reach toward her. Grace took a step back, her heart hammering. Then the phonograph spoke again, but the voice had changed. It was her own. "You can't run, Grace. You've already started." The room grew darker, the light from the jars dimming until they were barely more than faint glimmers. The figure in the corner began to move, its steps slow and deliberate. Grace's flashlight flickered wildly before going out completely, leaving her in total darkness. Panic clawed at her chest. She stumbled backward, her hands scrambling for the door. But the moment she turned, something cold and sharp brushed against her arm. She gasped, spinning around. The figure was inches away now, Its face, or what should have been a face, was featureless, a blank expanse of pale skin. But its presence was suffocating, its form radiating a cold that seeped into Grace's bones. A single word escaped its non-existent mouth, whispered directly into her mind. "Stay." Grace bolted. She didn't know how she found the door or how she managed to fling it open, but she ran. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees closer together, their branches clawing at her like they were alive. She could hear footsteps behind her, slow but relentless, matching the pounding of her heart. When she finally reached her car, she didn't look back. She threw herself into the driver's seat and turned the key, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. The engine roared to life, and she tore down the dirt road, not caring about the branches scraping against the sides of the car. When Grace reached her apartment, she locked every door and window, turned on every light, and sat on the floor, clutching a kitchen knife. Hours passed, but she couldn't sleep. The memory of the figure, its blank face, haunted her every thought. She glanced at the postcard on her coffee table. It was still there, taunting her with its message. Then her phone buzzed. A single notification lit up the screen. "You left something behind." Grace's breath caught. She didn't recognize the number, but the message was accompanied by a photo. It showed the cabin's interior, the phonograph sitting on the table. But in the corner of the frame, barely visible, was the doll. Its glassy eyes stared directly at the camera. Grace stared at her phone, the air in her apartment feeling thick and suffocating. The image of the doll burned into her mind, its painted smile more menacing than she remembered. The message beneath the photo was worse. "You left something behind." Her hands trembled as she set the phone down. Every rational part of her screamed to ignore it, to burn the postcards, to leave town and never look back. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever this was, it had already sunk its claws into her life, and running wasn't an option. The silence in her apartment was unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator made her jump. She turned on the TV for background noise, but even the cheerful chatter of a sitcom couldn't drown out the whispering in her mind. "Come back, Grace. You're not done yet." She grabbed the second postcard, staring at the address written in elegant cursive. Her curiosity, as much as her fear, urged her to go. She packed her bag again, this time adding a kitchen knife and a flashlight with fresh batteries. Before leaving, she glanced at the coffee table. The first postcard was gone. The third address led her to the outskirts of the city, to an abandoned amusement park. The place had been shut down for years, its rides rusted and overgrown with vines. Graffiti covered the once bright signs, and broken glass littered the ground. Grace parked her car near the entrance, her headlights illuminating the faded letters of the park's name. Whispering Pines Amusement Park. The gate was chained shut, but the lock had been broken, the chain hanging loosely. As she stepped inside, the wind carried the faint, haunting melody of a carousel, though the park seemed lifeless. Grace followed the sound, her footsteps crunching against gravel and shattered tiles. The carousel sat in the center of the park, its paint peeling and its horses frozen mid-gallop. The music stopped abruptly as she approached, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the distant creak of a Ferris wheel swaying in the wind. On one of the horses sat the doll. Its head was tilted to one side, its glassy eyes reflecting the dim moonlight. In its lap was the third postcard. Grace hesitated, her instincts screaming to leave. But she forced herself forward, her fingers trembling as she reached for the card. The doll's head snapped toward her. She stumbled back, clutching the postcard, her breath hitching. The doll didn't move again, but its eyes seemed to follow her as she read the message. "The truth waits below." Below? She looked around, her flashlight beam sweeping over the carousel. Beneath the chipped platform, she noticed a trapdoor partially concealed by debris. Grace pulled the debris away, the hinges of the trapdoor groaning as she lifted it. A narrow staircase led into darkness, the air thick with dampness and decay. The moment she descended, the trapdoor slammed shut behind her, plunging her into near-total darkness. Her flashlight flickered, casting long shadows against the stone walls. The staircase ended in a long corridor, its walls lined with mirrors. Each mirror was cracked, the reflections distorted. As Grace walked, she caught glimpses of herself, twisted, fractured versions that moved slightly out of sync. One reflection stopped moving entirely. Grace froze, staring at the motionless reflection. Her real self stepped closer to the glass, but the reflection didn't mirror her movement. Instead, it tilted its head, its eyes black and empty. The reflection raised a hand, pressing it against the inside of the mirror. A low, guttural whisper filled the corridor. "Help me!" Grace stumbled back, the voice growing louder, more desperate. The other mirrors began to ripple, their reflections blurring as shadows writhed within them. She broke into a run, the whispers following her, growing into screams. The corridor opened into a circular chamber, its walls covered in more mirrors. In the center was a small table, and on it lay a journal. Grace approached cautiously, her flashlight beam revealing the journal's worn leather cover. The name engraved on the cover made her blood run cold. Margaret Holloway. She opened the journal, flipping through its pages. The handwriting was frantic, the words barely legible. "The doll is the key. It binds us to the house, to the heart. I tried to destroy it, but it always comes back. It knows too much. It knows me. The mirrors. They show the truth, but they also show the lies. I don't know which is worse. If you're reading this, you've been chosen. I'm sorry." A sudden chill swept through the chamber, and Grace's flashlight flickered out. She fumbled with it, but the light didn't return. In the darkness, the mirrors began to glow faintly, their surfaces shimmering. Grace turned in a circle, her own fractured reflections staring back at her from every angle. Then, one by one, the reflections stepped out of the mirrors. They surrounded her, distorted versions of herself with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. Grace clutched the journal to her chest, backing away until she hit the wall. The reflections moved closer, their footsteps unnervingly silent. One of them spoke, its voice a warped echo of her own. "You shouldn't have come here." Another whispered, "The doll is watching." A third hissed, "You'll never leave." Grace screamed, closing her eyes and clutching the journal tighter. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were deafening. Then silence. When Grace opened her eyes, the chamber was empty. The mirrors were shattered, their shards scattered across the floor. Her flashlight flickered back to life, casting its beam onto the journal. She noticed something new. A map sketched on the last page, leading to a place marked only as the core. Grace climbed back up to the carousel, her legs shaking. The park was eerily silent, the wind completely still. The doll was gone. As she reached her car, another message buzzed on her phone. "Keep going. You're almost there." The photo attached showed the map from the journal, but the destination was circled in red. Her hands trembled as she started the car. Whatever awaited her at the core, she knew she couldn't stop now. Grace gripped the steering wheel tightly as she followed the directions from the map, her breath fogging the cold car interior. The red circle marking the core felt like a bullseye, not a destination, but a trap. Her car's headlights cut through the dense forest road. The silence of the night was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crunch of gravel under her tires. The deeper she drove, the narrower the road became, until it seemed more like a trail carved into the trees than a proper path. The map led her to a clearing. In the center stood a decrepit chapel, its roof sagging under the weight of years and neglect. The stained glass windows were shattered, and the bell tower tilted precariously, as though even the structure wanted to escape whatever lay inside. Grace hesitated, her car idling. Her instincts screamed to turn back, but the pull of the map, and the growing certainty that answers waited within, kept her rooted in place. She cut the engine and stepped out into the cold night air, clutching her flashlight and the journal tightly. The chapel door groaned as Grace pushed it open. The smell of mildew and rot hit her immediately, making her gag. Inside, pews lay overturned, and the altar was cracked, its stone surface covered in strange carvings similar to those in the amusement park's hidden chamber. At the center of the room was a large circular trapdoor, its surface inlaid with runes that pulsed faintly in the darkness. Grace's flashlight flickered as she approached, the beam dimming each time it passed over the trapdoor. The journal had mentioned the core only briefly, warning of its power. Grace flipped to the page with the map and scanned the scrawled notes again. The core binds the doll, the house, and the mirrors. To destroy it is to destroy the chain. But the price is steep. What price? Grace muttered under her breath. The sound of a faint laugh made her spin around, the flashlight beam darting across the shadows. Nothing. But she wasn't alone. As she turned back to the trapdoor, Grace realized the carvings were changing. The runes twisted and shifted, forming words in a language she couldn't understand. Then, with a heavy click, the trapdoor swung open on its own, revealing a steep staircase spiraling downward into darkness. She hesitated only a moment before descending, her flashlight barely illuminating the slick, stone walls. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the faint scent of ash and something metallic, blood, perhaps. The staircase ended in a massive underground chamber. The walls were covered in more carvings, but unlike before, these were moving. The symbols writhed like living things, their edges glowing faintly. At the center of the chamber was the core. It wasn't what she expected. The core wasn't a physical object. It was a sphere of darkness, floating several feet above the ground, its edges shimmering like oil on water. Tendrils of shadow pulsed outward, snaking into the walls and disappearing into the carvings. And in front of the core stood the doll. The doll was different now. It was larger, life-sized, and its once static, painted face now moved subtly, its smile widening unnaturally as Grace stepped closer. "You made it," a voice said. Grace froze. The voice wasn't coming from the doll, but from everywhere at once, echoing in the vast chamber. "What is this?" Grace demanded, her voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The shadows pulsed in time with her words, and the voice laughed. A low, resonant sound that made her skin crawl. "You already know the answer," it said. "You've known since the postcards arrived. You were chosen, Grace, just like those before you." "Chosen for what?" "To break the cycle," the voice replied. "Or to continue it." The doll stepped forward, its glassy eyes locking onto hers. In its hands was a small box, intricately carved with the same shifting runes that adorned the chamber walls. Inside this box, the voice continued, "is the truth. But the truth demands sacrifice." Grace hesitated, her mind racing. She thought of the journal's warning. The price is steep. She thought of the doll, the mirrors, the amusement park. Every step of this journey had brought her closer to some terrible revelation. And now, standing before the core, she was terrified of what lay ahead. "What happens if I refuse?" she asked. The voice grew darker, colder. Then the cycle continues. The doll returns. The postcards find another. And you become part of the house, just like the others. The images came unbidden to her mind. Margaret Holloway, the distorted reflections, the figures stepping out of the mirrors. All of them were people who had been chosen before her, and all of them had failed. Grace swallowed hard. And if I open the box? The shadows trembled, the tendrils of the core growing more agitated. If you open it, the cycle ends. But it will take something from you, something precious. The doll extended the box toward her, its head tilting unnaturally. Grace's hand shook as she reached out, her fingers brushing the cold, intricate surface. The carvings on the box flared to life, glowing brightly as if reacting to her touch. "What will it take?" she whispered. The voice didn't answer. She looked at the doll, its expression frozen in that eerie, painted smile. For a moment, she thought she saw something behind its eyes, something alive, watching her. Taking a deep breath, Grace pressed her thumb against the latch on the box. The moment it opened, the chamber erupted in light. Images flooded her mind. Flashes of the house, the mirrors, the amusement park, and the chapel. She saw Margaret Holloway holding the doll, her face twisted in despair. She saw figures trapped in the mirrors, their hands pressed against the glass as they screamed silently. And then she saw herself. In the final vision, Grace was standing in the center of the house, holding the doll. Her eyes were black, her body motionless. As the house consumed her piece by piece, the box snapped shut, and she was thrust back into the chamber. The core pulsed violently, its tendrils retracting as the shadows around her writhed. "You've seen the truth," the voice said. "Now make your choice." The doll stepped closer, its glassy eyes unblinking. The box in its hands seemed heavier now, as though it carried the weight of her decision. Grace looked at the core, then at the doll, her mind spinning. If she destroyed the core, the cycle would end, but at what cost? She took a step forward, raising the box toward the core. The shadows recoiled, the air crackling with energy. "I won't let this continue," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The voice roared in anger as she opened the box fully, its light enveloping the core. The tendrils writhed violently, their movements growing slower until, one by one, they fell limp. The core began to collapse in on itself, its darkness folding inward until it vanished completely. The doll crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The chamber began to shake, the walls cracking as the carvings lost their glow. Grace turned and ran, the staircase behind her crumbling as she ascended. She barely made it out of the chapel before it collapsed in on itself, the sound echoing through the forest. Standing in the clearing, Grace clutched the journal tightly. The doll was gone. The postcards were gone. But as she looked at her reflection in the car window, she saw something different in her eyes. A faint, black shimmer. The cycle had ended. Or had it? The weight of silence was crushing as Grace drove away from the ruins of the chapel. The forest, shrouded in darkness, seemed to close in on her from all sides. The night was unnaturally quiet, and even the hum of her car's engine seemed muted. She glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The faint, black shimmer in her eyes remained, a haunting reminder of what she had seen in the underground chamber. She gripped the wheel tighter, her mind racing. The core was gone. The doll was destroyed. The cycle should have ended. But something still felt wrong. Grace returned to her apartment as dawn began to break, casting pale light through the windows. Exhaustion weighed on her, but sleep was the last thing on her mind. She spread the journal and the postcards across her kitchen table, scanning them for any clue she might have missed. The final entry in the journal haunted her. To destroy the core is to destroy the chain. But the price is steep. It will claim a part of you forever. She didn't feel different, aside from the shimmer in her eyes, but the words echoed in her mind. What had the core taken? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Grace froze. No one ever visited her this early. She hesitated before approaching the door, her heart pounding. Peering through the peephole, she saw a man in a postal uniform, holding a single envelope. She opened the door cautiously. "This just arrived for you," the man said, his voice flat. His expression was blank, almost mannequin-like. Grace took the envelope, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she managed to say. But the man didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing down the hall without a word. She closed the door and stared at the envelope. Her name was written in elegant cursive on the front, but there was no return address. Slowly, she opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It showed her standing in the clearing outside the chapel, staring at the ruins. But the strange part was the figure behind her. Barely visible, cloaked in shadow, its features obscured. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She spun around, her eyes darting to every corner of her apartment. Nothing. She was alone. Or was she? As night fell, Grace's unease grew. The faint shimmer in her eyes seemed to intensify, and shadows around her apartment seemed to linger longer than they should. The air felt heavy, oppressive. She decided to burn the photograph. She lit a match and held it to the edge of the picture. The flames caught quickly, but instead of burning to ash, the photograph dissolved into black smoke, the image of the shadowy figure lingering in the air for a moment before fading. The lights in her apartment flickered. A faint laugh echoed through the room. Grace grabbed the journal, flipping through its pages desperately. There had to be something she missed, some way to end whatever this was. As she read, the black shimmer in her eyes began to spread, dark veins creeping across her vision. She stumbled to the bathroom mirror, horrified by what she saw. The shimmer had consumed her irises entirely, turning them into pools of darkness. The voice from the chamber echoed in her mind. "The price is steep. It will claim a part of you, forever." Her reflection began to shift. Behind her, the shadowy figure from the photograph appeared, its form growing clearer. It was her, but twisted, her face pale, her eyes completely black, her smile unnatural and wide. "Who are you?" Grace whispered, her voice trembling. The reflection smiled wider. "I'm what remains." The realization hit her like a freight train. By destroying the core, she hadn't ended the cycle. She had absorbed it. The power of the core now resided within her, and with it came its curse. Her doppelganger stepped forward in the mirror, pressing its hands against the glass. "You freed me," it said, its voice layered with hers. "And now we are one." "No," Grace whispered, backing away. "This isn't what I wanted." The reflection began to laugh, the sound growing louder until it filled the room. The mirror cracked, spiderwebbing outward from where the doppelganger's hands pressed against the surface. Grace turned and ran, grabbing the journal and postcards before fleeing her apartment. She drove aimlessly through the night, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and desperation. The shadowy figure seemed to follow her, flickering in the rearview mirror, lurking in the edges of her vision. Eventually, she found herself back at the amusement park. The gates stood open, the rusted rides creaking in the wind. It was as if the place had been waiting for her. Clutching the journal, Grace ventured inside. The carousel stood in the center, its once cheerful music now distorted and haunting. The mirrors lining the carousel reflected not her image, but the shadowy figure, her doppelganger, grinning at her from every surface. "Why are you doing this?" Grace shouted, her voice echoing through the empty park. The mirrors rippled, and her reflection stepped out, solidifying into a tangible form. It was her and yet not her, a twisted version that radiated malice. "You destroyed the core," the doppelganger said, its voice cold and mocking. "You broke the chain. But every chain has a link, Grace. And now you're it." Grace staggered backward. "No, I won't be part of this." The doppelganger tilted its head. "You don't have a choice. The core took your humanity, your light. What remains is me." Grace gripped the journal tightly. If she could destroy the core, maybe she could destroy this too. She flipped to the final pages, searching for a solution. The doppelganger lunged at her, its movements impossibly fast. Grace dodged, stumbling into the carousel. She grabbed one of the mirrors, shattering it against the ground. The doppelganger screamed, its form flickering. Grace realized the mirrors were the key. They were the last remnants of the core's power. She began smashing every mirror she could find, each one eliciting a shriek from the doppelganger. As the final mirror shattered, the doppelganger let out an ear-piercing wail. Its form disintegrated into black smoke, which swirled around Grace before disappearing into the night. The amusement park fell silent. Grace stood alone, her reflection once again her own in the shards of broken glass. But the shimmer in her eyes remained, a reminder of what she had done and what she had become. She left the park as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. The cycle was broken, but the darkness within her would never fade.